So far, the arguments we've looked at have been fairly straightforward. As a result, it's been pretty clear how to put them into standard form. But there are a number of ways in which things can get more complicated. Important ways that you need to be aware of if you're going to be able to analyze arguments as they are typically presented in the real world. The first way in which an argument can be more complicated that we're going to look at is by being an extended argument. Extended arguments are sets of interrelated arguments. Extended arguments can take on a variety of forms. For example, an extended argument can consist of an attempt to establish a conclusion by stating premises and in addition by producing evidence for those premises. In such cases, the premises of the main argument are themselves conclusions of subsidiary arguments. These subsidiary arguments are called subarguments. Extended arguments can also consist of an argument that explains the pros and cons of a position and presents arguments for each side before selecting one conclusion. An extended argument can also be a set of arguments for several closely related conclusions, or a presentation of several different arguments for the same conclusion. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example of this last type of extended argument. Example of an extended argument taken from your book. Actually, originally there were 3 subpoints here, but for our purposes we only need to look at 2. In this argument, the ultimate conclusion is stated right out at the front. Women need to invest more in retirement, and then we're given an indicator that we're going to have a couple different arguments by this phrase for several reasons. And then 2 of the reasons are listed here below. 1. According to the National Bureau for Health Statistics, women tend to live an average of 5 years longer than men, and thus spend a longer time in retirement. This number 1, all on its own, could function as an argument for the conclusion women need to invest more in retirement. But since we've got the second one conjoined with it, this becomes an extended argument. The second argument is as follows. On average, women earn less than men. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics, women worked full-time year-round earned only 80 cents for every dollar earned by men. Because women earn less money, they have less money to invest. Okay, so in a straightforward way, this is an extended argument because we've got 2 separate arguments for a single conclusion. But things are even a little more interesting than that. If we look at this first argument, we can see that even within itself, we've got a subargument. One of the indicators that we've got a subargument here is the presence of this indicator word thus, which is a conclusion indicator word. The same thing's going to happen down in number 2, and here we have the indicator word because, indicating a premise. But okay, let's start with number 1. Here we've got our conclusion indicator word, and we could reasonably expect that what follows is a conclusion. And indeed it is. It's the claim that women spend a longer time in retirement than men. This conclusion drawn from the fact that, according to the National Bureau of Health Statistics, women tend to live an average of 5 years longer than men. Thus, what we have here is we've got a premise, women tend to live an average of 5 years longer than men, leading to a very straightforward conclusion from it, thus, women spend a longer time in retirement. And it's this claim that women spend a longer time in retirement, which in turn is used to support our ultimate conclusion that women need to invest more in retirement. Something similar is going on with number 2, only there's actually 2 levels here. Let's start by looking at our premise indicator word because. It says because women earn less money, implicitly meaning less money than men, we could assume that this is going to be a premise. But a premise for what? Well, it's a premise for the claim that women have less money to invest. So here we've got a premise, women earn less money than men, leading to the conclusion that women have less money to invest. And it's this claim that women have less money to invest, which in turn is being used to support the claim that women need to invest more in retirement. But what we have here is actually 2 tiers of support in the extended argument in number 2, because this premise, women earn less money than men, is in fact also a conclusion drawn from this statistic that women earn only 80 cents on the dollar for men. So this premise grounds this conclusion, which in turn becomes a premise to ground this conclusion, and this in turn becomes a premise to ground this conclusion. Thus, if we were looking just at number 2 alone, if we were to put it into standard form, it would look something like this. We've got our initial premise. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics, women who worked full-time year-round earned only 80 cents for every dollar earned by men, to ground the conclusion that on average, women earn less money than men. This, in turn, becomes a premise for the conclusion that on average, women have less money to invest than men, which in turn, this conclusion becomes a premise for the conclusion, our ultimate conclusion, that women need to invest more in retirement than men. So you can start to see how the simplistic standard form gets more complicated when we're working with extended arguments. Let's take a look at another example. This one comes from science. Because publishers are aiming at a national market, the number one criterion for any textbook is avoidance of controversy. Since they must respond to a variety of specific criteria from their buyers, this has resulted in what has been called the dumbing down of textbooks. Let's start by highlighting the indicator words. We've got several. We've got because, which is a premise indicator word, since, which is a premise indicator word, and I also highlighted this has resulted in. This wasn't on your list of indicator words in the last video, but it's functioning like a conclusion indicator word, like therefore or hence. So if we start from this being a conclusion indicator phrase, what follows is likely to be a conclusion, and that's in fact what we've got going on. The dumbing down of textbooks, the fact that this is occurring, that's a conclusion. It's a conclusion supported by the premise marked off from here, that publishers must respond to a variety of specific criteria from their buyers. Okay, so we've got a premise that's supporting a conclusion here. What's going on with this first sentence? You might think initially that it's another premise for this conclusion, but it seems like perhaps a more natural way to read what's going on here is that we've got a second premise and a related conclusion. The second premise being publishers are aiming at a national market, and the conclusion being drawn that the number one criterion for any textbook is avoidance of controversy. So here we've got premise followed by a conclusion, premise followed by a separate conclusion, although the conclusions are related in a certain sort of sense. So if we want to turn this into standard form, it's going to look like this. You've got your first argument with a single premise, publishers are aiming at a national market, and then the conclusion, the number one criterion for any textbook is avoidance of controversy, and then a second argument with the premise, publishers must respond to a variety of specific criteria from their buyers, and the conclusion. This has resulted in what has been called the dumbing down of textbooks. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, it's perhaps not obvious that the premise, publishers are aiming at a national market, leads to the conclusion that the number one criterion for any textbook is avoidance of controversy. It seems like the only way this premise is going to support that conclusion is if there's some connection between aiming at a national market and avoiding controversy. And this seems plausible, that there might be some sort of connection, and it's probably something that the author was implicitly assuming but didn't explicitly state. This leads us into the next topic that we're going to discuss, which is incompletely stated arguments. Many arguments in English are incompletely stated, which is to say that some premises and even the conclusion of an argument may be omitted. So circumstances in which a premise or multiple premises or the conclusion is omitted, it's not explicitly stated, those are instances of incompletely stated arguments. Once we recognize the presence of an argument, we frequently have to reconstruct it by supplying these missing parts before we can evaluate its strength. Why do incompletely stated arguments happen? Well, in ordinary language, it's often just because stating all these extra details would be boring or obvious to a reader. So the argument's structured in such a way that it won't be so boring. But when our purpose is to examine an argument, it's best to get all those missing pieces laid out there as well. So let's take an example from your book where an incompletely stated argument is offered. Suppose you are wondering whether Jeb, your lab partner in a chemistry class who was worried about paying a tuition bill, settled his account. Another friend, who works in the registrar's office, says, Jeb must have come up with the money, since his application to graduate on Sunday has been approved. The approval of Jeb's application to graduate convinces you that his bill has been paid, because, as every student knows, Degrees are not granted to those with unpaid tuition bills. Even though no student with an unpaid graduation bill can graduate is unstated, this is a premise of the argument that supports the conclusion that Jeb's tuition bill was paid. Without this premise, there is no clear connection between bill paying and graduation. Because you and your friend are both aware of the relevance of the truth of the premise, however, there was no need to mention it. Okay, so let's take a look at what your friend actually said, what he actually stated as his argument. We've got Jeb must have come up with the money since his application to graduate on Sunday has been approved. Well, let's start with the obvious. Let's find our indicator word, since. As this word often does, it's picking out a premise, namely that Jeb's application to graduate on Sunday has been approved. And this is being used to reinforce the conclusion Jeb must have come up with the money. So let's go ahead and put this in standard form. We've got our premise, Jeb's application to graduate on Sunday has been approved, and then our conclusion, therefore Jeb must have come up with the money. But the author of your textbook, her point was that without some relevant background knowledge, namely that you don't graduate unless you've paid your tuition bills, the fact that Jeb's application to graduate on Sunday has been approved wouldn't clearly indicate that Jeb must have come up with the money. You need to have this additional piece of information. Because you as a student and your friend both would have known this, your friend didn't need to state it. But if we want to technically look at all the information being used to support this conclusion that Jeb must have come up with the money, we need to add the implicit premise. Once we've done that, the argument looks like this. Jeb's application to graduate on Sunday has been approved. No student with an unpaid bill can graduate, therefore Jeb must have come up with the money. Now we can see the relationship explicitly between these two pieces of information and why it is that Jeb must have come up with the money, because he's graduating on Sunday. This statement, the one no student with an unpaid bill can graduate, this is our implicit or unstated premise. Your book tends to use the phrase unstated premise. I'll sometimes use the phrase implicit premise, but they both mean the same thing. An implicit or unstated premise is a premise that is not explicitly stated as part of the argument, but is assumed as part of the relevant background knowledge, making the explicitly stated premise or premises support the conclusion of an argument. So in this case, this piece of information was not explicitly stated, but it was relevant and sensible for your friend to assume that this was part of your background knowledge, so that your friend didn't have to say it. You could figure out this connection all on your own. Implicit premises are often cases of generalizations. These generalizations will often fall into two types: universal generalizations and statistical generalizations. Universal generalizations are claims that state that all or no members of one class are members of another class. Examples of universal generalizations include claims like no student with an unpaid bill can be graduated, and all tuition bills must be paid before graduation. The reason they're universal generalizations is because they address the entire class of students in the first case and tuition bills in the second case. The other type of generalizations are called statistical generalizations. These are claims that state that some portion other than all or none of the members of a class are part of another class. Statistical generalizations can reference specific percentages or fractions of a class, or can consist of more general qualifiers like most, usually, seldom, frequently, and rarely. Examples of statistical generalizations include most families who drive new Cadillacs are wealthy, and 53% of Americans voted for Obama in the 2010 presidential election. Here we've got an example of just a general qualifier word, most families. It's not the case that all families, but it's the case for the majority, for most. And then here we've got a statistical generalization that focuses on a more specific percentage, namely 53%. Okay, let's take a look at a few other generalizations and try to determine if they're universal or statistical. Here's one. Few college ball players become professional athletes. Is this universal or statistical? Well, let's look at what kind of qualifier we've got. We've got few. So this says not many. Some, but not a large percentage. So this is going to be statistical. It's talking about some members of a class, but not all of them. Let's try this one. He who is not thrashed is not educated. Here, there's not really a qualifier word to look at, but to try to figure out what's going on, think about it this way. It's saying implicitly anyone who is not thrashed is not educated. So since it's talking about anyone, it's going to be universal. Before closing out this video, I just want to look at a few more cases where we've got implicit premises. If after we're done with this, you still want more practice, there are tons of examples in your book that you can look through. And the even-numbered questions have answers in the back. So you can always check your work on the even-numbered ones. But okay, let's look at this first argument here. Snowdrops are members of the amaryllis family of bulbs and are thus unattractive to rodents. There's an implicit premise here, but let's start by just figuring out how to organize what's explicitly stated. We've got our conclusion indicator word, thus, which indicates what follows is probably the conclusion. And it is. What's the conclusion we've got? Snowdrops are unattractive to rodents. That's the conclusion. And that would make this other piece of information plausibly a premise. Let's take a look and see. Snowdrops are members of the amaryllis family of bulbs. Yep, that seems to be a premise, so let's organize it that way. So now we've got our premise on top, our conclusion on the bottom. But the question we've got now is, why is it the case that snowdrops, being members of the amaryllis family of bulbs, is evidence or support for the claim that snowdrops are unattractive to rodents? What kind of premise, specifically what kind of generalization, what might we be able to throw in here that would make this a relevant piece of support for this? Well, the answer is going to be that you have to say something about the relationship between members of the amaryllis family of bulbs and their unattractiveness to rodents. If it's the case that no members of the amaryllis family of bulbs are attracted to rodents, i.e. all of them are unattractive to rodents, that would supply the appropriate sort of connection. So let's go ahead and put that in. So now we've got a fully fleshed out argument with our first premise, snowdrops are members of the amaryllis family of bulbs. A second premise, members of the amaryllis family of bulbs are unattractive to rodents. From these two pieces of information, we can see that snowdrops are going to be unattractive to rodents. Okay, let's look at one more example. Female office workers work just as hard as male office workers and are just as productive. Therefore, office workers who are women should receive the same pay as men in comparable positions. Okay, this one's really easy to put into standard form. The first sentence was the premise, and the second one was the conclusion. The question now is, why is it the case that the fact that female office workers work just as hard as male office workers and are just as productive support for the claim that office workers who are women should receive the same pay as men in comparable positions? Well, if we're thinking about why someone would state just these two things and think they've made an argument, a good one, they've probably got some kind of implicit assumption going on in the background that if you work just as hard as someone and are just as productive as someone, regardless of sex, you should get paid the same when you're in a comparable position. And hey, that's going to be our implicit premise. So those are the only examples I've done here, but like I said before, if you want to keep practicing, go take a look at the book. Lots of examples there.